Thank you very much indeed, Patrick. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and really wonderful. Literally 9 years to the week after Ian Skelly and I began working with the Prince of Wales on his book Harmony, that we're still seeing such momentum being carried by this piece of work. It is truly visionary, and I have to say this was one of the most important learning experiences of my life, was working on this book. It really opened my eyes to many things that were previously invisible to me, and having spent so many years dwelling in the world of conservation, that was really quite a shock actually, to know that big elements of what I'd been doing had been neglecting really quite major dimensions of the whole piece. Patrick mentioned the separation between the worldly and the spiritual as being one of the main themes that's picked up in Harmony. Another is the separation between people and the natural world, and it's on that subject this morning that I'd like to share a few remarks, because following the publication of Harmony, I've spent the last 7 years working very intensively on the idea of natural capital, which is a concept that flowed directly out of this book. Now, natural capital is an idea that's slightly controversial amongst the environmental community, because what we're doing when we talk about natural capital is really beginning to draw a parallel between financial capital and how the natural world works. Because if you look at a set of ecosystems or biodiversity, you realize that if you husband them and look after them, you can get dividends long into the future. It's rather like making a financial investment. If you blow your financial capital, you no longer get dividends or interest, and that's the parallel we try to draw in Harmony between the way we look at the natural world and the extent to which it's declining, because we see it as something that can be endlessly abused and liquidated to meet short-term human needs, and yet not being able to see the longer-term consequences. And one of the reasons why this is so prevalent in the modern world, this misperception, is because we have become so disconnected from nature. And so the idea of natural capital, aside from being quite a technical discussion about economics, is really a way of reconnecting people with the reality that we inhabit. And that reality is that we are 100% dependent upon healthy natural systems for our well-being. I'm sure many people in the room won't be surprised to hear that. But when it comes to food and farming, this is where natural capital is perhaps most obviously an important factor in terms of how we need to plan for the future. And there are many, many levels to this. Perhaps the most fundamental of all is soil. We just walked across some grass outside on the way in here. Many of us probably didn't think about the ecosystem beneath our feet, but it is one of the most complicated and profound systems on planet Earth. You take a tablespoon from that soil out there, take it to a lab, sit down with an electron microscope, you might count 6 billion individual organisms in there. Nematodes, bacteria, viruses, microfungi, all operating in a complex set of relationships that is enabling the soil to discharge a series of really critical functions, including those which support human well-being. In addition to water retention and holding billions of tons of carbon, of course that organic matter is recycling nutrients, and the recycling of nutrients is of course what enables plant growth, and plant growth is the basis of agriculture. It's a fundamental and profound set of ecological relationships, but which in our modern world we disregard utterly. I think it's more common for most people to have the cultural label of dirt referring to this particular miracle of nature, and with that in mind we abuse it, we concrete over it, and of course we farm it in ways which are utterly unsustainable. And that unsustainability is seen in a range of really alarming trends. I recently produced some material looking at soil damage across the world. We're now up to about 1/3 of agricultural soils being either highly or disastrously degraded. It takes many manifestations. It's the destruction of the organic material as we're removing more and more crops without replacing organic matter. It's soil compaction and, of course, soil erosion, the physical loss of the soil from the fields and from the landscape into rivers and then into the sea. I guess sometimes we're inclined to think of that particular problem as being something which is in the tropical countries where deforestation is taking place, but actually it's right here on our doorstep. One remarkable reminder of that for me a couple of years ago was when the International Space Station passed over southern England in March 2014, following a very wet winter. And the astronauts looking down upon southern England from 300 kilometers up remarked on this brown fringe lying around the British coast, especially around the big river estuaries. Runoff, one of the astronauts said. Actually, what he might equally have said is soil. because that was millions of tons of topsoil departing the land, going across fields, into streams, and then into rivers, and then into the ocean. And if you look at the way in which we farm very often, look out of the train window or the car window, you'll find the plough lines going straight down the side of the hill into the watercourses. And when it rains, the soil leaves the fields. This is utterly insane, and yet this is one of the ways in which we see that we need to meet the needs of people in a planet where we've had the perception of rising population and adopted, the reality of rising population and adopted industrial farming methods to meet that particular challenge. And as a result of that, we've adopted these really grossly destructive practices. Aside from the farming practices taking place on the soils and the way in which we're ploughing and leaving bare ground over winter, is also the way in which we've moved from mixed farming to industrial monoculture. And at the same time as doing that, we've removed many ecosystem features. Wetlands have been drained, grasslands have been ploughed, hedges removed, and woodlands grubbed up, all in order to make bigger and bigger fields, exacerbating that particular problem. At the same time as we've done that, of course, the other bit of natural capital that we've been depleting is the above-ground biodiversity, not only simplifying the soils, but also the ecosystems on top. And of course, those ecosystems are also critical for food production, not least through the activity of pollinators. So most of the flowering plants on Earth today are insect pollinated, including 2/3 of the world's crop plant varieties. As a result of the loss of habitat and the use of toxic chemicals, those insect populations have been declining, and as a result of that, food security is being imperiled. Sometimes we try to calculate the value of these kinds of services, and when it comes to pollinators, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, a technical study published in 2010 estimated that we're receiving something like $190 billion of value per year from insect pollination. Now, these kinds of figures, they're a bit controversial sometimes. They're quite hard to bottom out in very specific ways. But now and again, you get an insight as to how those numbers might actually stack up through specific examples. And one that really struck me is photographs taken in southwestern China, where you find fruit farmers in the springtime climbing the apple trees with paintbrushes, moving the pollen between the blossoms by hand because all the insects have been killed by industrial quantities of toxic chemicals that have been deliberately deployed in order to control pests. So they did control pests, but at the same time, obviously killed many of the pollinators. And at the same time as we're killing pollinators in attempts to reduce pest attacks, we're also removing beneficial animals from the landscape. Many recent studies telling us how we derive enormous benefit from the many natural predators of pest species. One study that struck me as being particularly illustrative was an experiment conducted in a Dutch apple orchard, whereby half of the orchard was covered with mist nets, so very fine netting to prevent the penetration by songbirds, but still allowing moths to lay their eggs and caterpillars to hatch, which damage the fruit. And then in the other half of the orchard, nest boxes being fitted to encourage great tits to come and nest in there. Very technical piece of analysis, but to cut a long story short, in the half of the orchard where the birds were present compared to where they were excluded, there was a 50% higher high-quality apple harvest than there was in the place where the birds were kept out. The insects could get in. So you find in these kinds of instances where you actually begin to gather data, you see how we can reveal hidden values that are worth many billions of pounds. And in the case of those birds, it seems to me that we still lack the tools to be able to calculate the kinds of values that are being provided, whereas when it comes to pesticide sales and the impact of that on GDP and competitiveness, we seem to be very adept. We can put dollar values on them. But when we start to look at these other less obvious values, we find enormous impacts coming from the way in which we're farming, removing natural capital contributions, which in the end will begin to undermine food security. So soil health, the recycling of nutrients, the activities of pollinators, the activities of natural pest controllers, all contributing to agriculture in ways that has real economic value. And then on top of all of that, of course, is the ultimate limiter of agriculture on land, which is the availability of fresh water. I think in our modern society we're inclined to think that water comes out of taps or increasingly out of bottles, including plastic ones, when in fact at the end of the day it's 100% being governed by the activity of natural systems, ranging from plankton in the ocean, which are seeding rain clouds, through to forests and wetlands which store and purify water, and again then to the recycling of water on land by ecosystems, particularly forests, which are evaporating moisture back into the atmosphere. When we begin to damage these systems on a large scale, that can have impacts on water security. And over recent years, I've seen several examples of this, including in Brazil in 2014-15, following a very long period of drought that affected food production in the La Plata basin of northern Argentina, Paraguay, and southern Brazil, and that was linked with the destruction of tropical forests in the Amazon. More recently, I traveled to West Africa to understand the sustainability of cocoa production there, and was very struck by conversations I had with local farmers, with the government officials, and with major cocoa and chocolate companies, all telling me the same story about impact on yields over recent years being caused by very prolonged and severe drought, and indeed droughts of unprecedented severity and length. And this, they all put down to the loss of the tropical forests in that part of the world. And it was striking to note how the highest cocoa yields that remain in Ivory Coast are now clustered around the Thai Forest National Park, which is the last piece of intact tropical rainforest in that part of the world. And we're beginning to understand that it's not only adjacent to the tropical rainforests, and there's a clue in the name for those of you still listening, the rain part, not only in relation to the localities around those forests, but also very distant from them. And indeed, researchers have been developing the idea, now based on a lot of evidence, of so-called sky rivers. And this is the long-distance transport of water coming from tropical forest ecosystems that are acting as a kind of a biological pump. So as the rain is being dragged off of the ocean over to the interiors of these continental areas covered in tropical forest, the water is being re-evaporated back into the atmosphere, and as the water is rising, as vapor, it condenses, and as it condenses, the volume decreases, pulling up more air from beneath, thereby driving up drafts, which then turn into these long-distance water transfers going literally thousands of miles. And indeed, if you travel to the grain belt of North America, the Great Plains of South Dakota, North Dakota, there's Amazonian and Central American rain going that far up, traveling on these very long-distance air currents being powered by the tropical rainforests. So these are fundamental dependencies that we ignore at our peril. And as we look forward to the future of farming, it's going to be essential that we move beyond the idea that technology can solve all of our problems, and to be able to see that the reality that we inhabit, whereby 100% of our economy, and of course all of our farming, is dependent on nature. So this is really a crisis of perception that we face. Good morning, sir. A crisis of perception that we face, which is leading us down a very destructive path, which is literally unsustainable. That means it cannot continue. If you destroy soils, if you remove pollinators, if you take away the natural pest control, if you destroy the natural systems that purify and renew water, your farming system cannot go on. So we do need to change the way in which we look at all of this, and not only from the point of view of sustaining food production, but other essential things that we need to do in the 21st century and beyond, not least to be able to limit the effects of climate change and cope with the consequences of that. And one of the most important ways we have of doing this is to increase soil organic matter, putting more carbon in the soil and less into the atmosphere, and also to conserve the forests, especially the tropical rainforests that are so important for the planet's hydrology. Just to leave you with one final thought, aside from this being a crisis of perception and humankind now seeing itself outside nature, this is also a crisis of economics. And I think if we're going to look forward to a more sustainable and durable future for farming, we need to begin to measure things differently. Cheap food has become the totem for policymakers across the world and food companies, but actually it's not cheap at all once you start factoring in the multi-billion-pound damage being done day in, day out to the systems that sustain agriculture. So we need to start measuring the natural capital and coming up with a more rational economic assessment of whether we're succeeding or not. If we did that, I think we could go a long way toward not only sustaining farming, but sustaining the rest of life on Earth. Thank you very much indeed.